Sustainability can often seem like a depressing catalog of doom and gloom. But although we face serious challenges, a better and more sustainable future is possible. Welcome to Sustainable Planet.
Welcome to this episode of Sustainable Planet. I'm political scientist Kimberly Weir, and my co-host and spouse is political scientist Michael Baranowski. Today we're going to be talking about why we buy so much stuff. We started off Sustainable Planet with a few episodes on some general information and examples about this. So if you missed them, be sure to go back and listen. There is so much to talk about with sustainability. So this is our chance to talk more about consumerism and why we're compelled to buy stuff. Having taught lessons in an entire course on sustainability, I've had a lot of time to think about why I buy stuff. Michael K., why do you buy and collect stuff?
Well, I buy a lot more stuff than you do, certainly. And when you asked me that question before we started recording a few days ago, actually, I gave it some thought. And I think specifically when it comes to collecting, which is stuff that is not necessary for life in any way. And like a lot of people, I'm a collector. Kimberly knows I collect pocket knives and watches. And it's obviously something that's not necessary. I mean, why do I need a knife, more than one knife, right? Why do I need a watch when I have a phone? And I think there are a number of things. And I think this is true for a lot of collectors. Part of it's just being part of a community of people who share an interest. Part of it is this idea, at least when you're a collector of some things, is that you develop expertise in an area, and that feels good in some sort of small, constrained area. You know, I can tell you the difference between 10 different types of knife steel. And does that matter in the larger scheme? No, but it's a type of community. It's a type of, again, that feeling of expertise and mastery and that. And for a lot of things, and you can do it without breaking the bank in any sort of way. I mean, I could sell all my watches and knives and not be able to afford a single Rolex, right? But so I think there are a lot of really potentially important and tangible benefits that at least I get through that. And not only that, but just the aesthetic. I like to look down at my wrist or in my pocket and say, oh, this is a nice looking thing. So I get a lot out of it, really.
But that you're talking about collecting. But what about just general consumption, right? Like, what if you're buying a new toothbrush? What do you think about when you buy a toothbrush? Is it about brand name or is the generic okay, right? Is it about the price? Is it about what it can do for your health? Does it help you save time, right? Do you like the timer on the electric toothbrush better? You know? Is it because some influencer was touting it on social media? Or do you just need a new toothbrush? I mean, we go through this all the time in our house when we try to buy something.
Oh my God.
And spend so much time, right? We just had to get dog food yesterday. Michael spent half an hour trying to sort out dog food and the amount that we need and put it on subscribe and save. And it's coming, right? And it wasn't just that. It was what's the right brand? What's the best brand for our dogs? Are we going to bother to get some sort
Should
of
it be the large breed, senior, small bites, digestive health? I mean, it's insane. And of course, that's, I think, what makes consumerism so challenging. If you want to do it in a responsible and sustainable way, it takes so much time that it can just be maddening.
And it's about not just buying that product. It's about then, is it eco-friendly? Like with the toothbrush, does it have replacement heads, or is the whole thing headed for the landfill every month that you're supposed to replace your toothbrush for the people who do that, right? You have like a gazillion choices to make. And we're talking about something as basic and necessary as a toothbrush or dog food. And so this is where we're at. When it comes to consumption, there are all of these different layers of it that we have to consider. And that's what we want to talk about today is why are we at this point? And so we're going to give you a little theory lesson. And so don't turn it off because it's not going to be terrible. But it's really useful. So we're going to talk about Karl Marx. And don't turn it off because first of all, Michael's laughing, right? Because a lot of times you hear Karl Marx and it's like that knee-jerk reaction. It's like this communism, right? It's this whole thing all over. And we're going to become the Soviet Union. And no, that's not what it's about. And also, we're going to spare you from slogging through the 3 volumes of Das Kapital and still give you some basic information that's really useful. Karl Marx said that buying stuff is about social relations. And he says that when it comes to the way where we've ended up in this world, like people think of him as an economist, but at heart, he's really a sociologist because he cared about social relations. And he offers a lot of insight to us about how ultimately it was the Industrial Revolution that was the reason why we started to be in competition with each other to have bigger, better things, more stuff. And he said what happened in the Industrial Revolution is that it separated the producer from the consumer. So the people making this stuff don't have a vested interest beyond keeping their job to satisfying the people buying the stuff. And the consumers don't really care a whit about people who are making their stuff as long as it's decent quality. So what he comes up with is this concept that he calls commodity fetishism. And basically what commodity fetishism is, it's about real value versus perceived value. That real value is in the actual utility of the good. So it's a toothbrush or it's a table or something. Whereas perceived value is the worth that we put on that object, the social values that are imbued in that object. So a polo shirt isn't just a polo shirt if it's a Ralph Lauren brand polo shirt. That rises it and elevates it in status. And the person wearing that is, oh, look, I'm wearing my Ralph Lauren polo shirt, whereas all I can afford is my generic Walmart polo shirt. And so Marx argues that this whole process has dehumanized us because we don't care about people so much anymore. All we care about is our relationship with people in terms of how much better we can be than them because of the stuff that we buy. Thoughts, Michael K?
Well, I guess I'll start with saying that Marx is a slog. The guy is, but you got to remember, he's a 19th century German philosophy, political economy guy, and that right away, red flags everywhere. But I do think I think there's something to what he says, at least in a sense where my takeaway is that he sees this as bad mainly because it essentially obscures what he would argue is the exploitation that's inherent in capitalism. Because if we just focus on the end product and we separate it from the people who are making it, if we cut that nexus, which is inevitable in mass production, then we're not going to appreciate what goes into making that and all the potentially exploitation. And so I think that's true. But I think where he goes off a little bit is he focuses, it seems to me, too exclusively just on the utility of objects, because it's true that a table has utility as a table. I think table's the example he uses in that part. Yes. But also, I think there's also there's aesthetic value in things, and that is a real value that is meaningful to people's lives. Now, as you point out, you could have two, say, polo shirts or tables that look exactly the same, but one has this fancy pedigree and all this, but they're otherwise the same. Well, then, yeah, that's when it becomes buying a commodity just to associate yourself with that name. But I would argue, too, that also has some potential social value. People say, oh, look, that guy's got a real polo shirt and not a knockoff. And so I think that part of it, I think he comes off as being kind of a moralistic prig sort of person. But when we get to, I think, the element that really focuses on what we're concerned about, sustainability and understanding what goes into the things we make, I think he's got a real point there.
I agree. I think that what's really important about commodity fetishism is that when it comes to sustainability, is that it helps to explain why we've gotten into this huge hole that we have, right? And it's interesting because going back to the brand names and collectability, I don't know, of stuff like the watches or the knives or something, there is something to be said for having nice, aesthetically pleasing things. And as Michael started out the episode talking about how he feels like he's part of a community of collectors. But at the same time, we end up in this situation where we end up caring more about that item that we possess than where it's being made or how it's being made. And that's especially true of when we start talking about mass-produced brand name products. They're coming out of factories where, when it comes to sustainability, we're not on track for a sustainable planet if we continue to consume at the rate we are and outstripping the resources faster than they're being replenished.
Yeah, and I certainly don't disagree with that. I mean, there are real concerns, and we don't, generally speaking, think about all of that goes into the things we buy, whether they're pocket knives or watches or tables or what have you. In part, I think because of that disconnect that Marx points out has been going on now for well over a century, but also I think because it just becomes daunting to do that. If we want all of these things at low prices that are conveniently, oftentimes delivered literally right to our doorstep, then we don't want the added emotional, psychic, what have you, burden of trying to come to terms with what that requires. And I certainly appreciate that.
And not even just come to terms with, but actually, if you want to be conscientious about it, actually going and doing some research, and how often and how much time can we do that for every single thing we want to consume? And I think that's in part where the arts and craft movement, that's not a new thing, right? Arts and craft movement came along at the turn of the century in reaction to this exact same thing. This is something that's been going on, reactions to mass-produced decor, mass-produced products for a long time.
Yeah, and I've been fascinated by the arts and crafts movement for a long time. It's actually started out in Victorian England, mid to late 19th century, essentially. William Morris and John Ruskin were two big figures in that, probably the two main figures. And they saw the industrialization in England and thought, well, there's all this cheap, shoddy stuff. And they also recognize that disconnect between the workers and the product. And you have people in these factories just making part of something and not getting any inherent fulfillment out of doing that, just getting a paycheck, essentially, and oftentimes not a good one. And so their thinking was, well, we should try to start some sort of movement where we could produce simple, basic, good quality things. Workers can take pride in making them. Buyers can take pride in owning them, and all created in a way that makes that work fulfilling and meaningful and at a price that people can afford. And that's a fantastic idea. I love it. But the problem is that at a price that regular people could afford, no one could figure out a way to basically scale that. And that's fundamentally one of the problems with that. I would also argue that for so many of the things we buy today, like electronics, for instance, there is no way to really do that necessarily in that kind of handcrafted sort of way. So I admire the ideal, but I think that it's just not necessarily all that realistic for a lot of people in the 21st century, rich countries of the world, I guess.
Yeah, and I just interviewed Akshat Rati, who wrote Climate Capitalism, and you can hear our interview on Sustainable Planet, that one of the things in his book that he writes about is how Unilever, as a corporation, actually changed their approach under their most recent CEO, because they realized exactly what Michael was just talking about, that Unilever is based on having to sell loads of products at a huge scale across the whole entire planet. And if they're going to be a successful corporation, they need to be able to do that. And also, though, need to be able to do it in a sustainable way, because that's where we're at. We're and Marx talks about how capitalism isn't just little microcosmic bits of activity going on. We are in a macroeconomic system, and we're all connected together. And that he would say, when it comes to handcrafted, artisanal, all of those little fancy names that we have on our products that make us feel, ooh, like we like to think that we're connected to the person making our handcrafted microbrewery beer, that this is a different relationship that we have. But ultimately, he would argue that we're choosing these products because it elevates our social status, or it makes us feel good about ourselves, or, it's better for health, or whatever it is that we're, all of those sort of lines that we feed ourselves. But ultimately, he would argue that this is part of an exploitative system. And that for him, it was, we need to bring it down. And, ultimately, the rise of capital, fall of capitalism, rise of communism. And this is where Marx really starts to fall apart. So we're not going to go into that part of the lesson, but we are entrenched in this exploitative capitalist system, and we are facing serious climate change issues. So we have to make some issues. And so I think that's why it's really useful to talk about commodity fetishism, because I think this gives us a way to better recognize the impetus for why we buy things, why we're so keyed into consumption, and allows us to take a step back to look at why it is that we're actually doing all of this consuming.
Yeah, and I think what's problematic about it is it's really difficult to just sort of unilaterally make a decision to be different about this, given all the messages we're bombarded with. I know we're at some point, I'm sure we're going to do an episode specifically on, say, fast fashion or something like that, where all those messages that you see, like last week, I saw a TJ Maxx commercial where the basic gist of it was, I can totally redo my wardrobe, right, at low prices. But my first thought was, at what cost, though, right? And I think that's maybe how one way to look at it is to think about the difference between the price of these things and the cost of these things. And I think that's an important distinction to make that maybe we don't think about a lot. What I mean is this, is that the price of things is what we see on the sticker, what's being charged for it. But the cost of these things is just the overall expense that's involved with making this product. And I don't mean whatever cost the manufacturer, whatever they're paying out, but also what economists call externalities, right? The costs or the benefits to people who aren't directly involved in that transaction, like environmental degradation, like resource use, and those sort of things. And we definitely think about the price because we see the price, we pay that price literally. But what we don't recognize is the cost, and we're going to end up paying for that at some point down the line, but that's not built in on the front end, and so we don't appreciate it nearly as much.
And that's certainly not the message we're getting from celebrities or social influencers or media influencers, whatever. The message we get is it's not only okay, but we need to do this because this is how we're going to be glamorous, or this is how you can aspire to be like me and you can be rich, or whatever it is, and the environment be damned. If you just use this product, it's going to make your life better. But it doesn't consider the actual cost outside of the literal sticker price that we're paying. And it's about, with commodity fetishism, that's part of that built in, disconnecting us, keeping at a very, very far. It used to be an arm's length from who those producers were and where this stuff was happening. Now it's literally halfway across the globe for people who live in global north countries. This stuff is happening in emerging economies and developing countries where they don't have the standards for the environment standards or the labor standards or the same sort of laws in place, rule of law and protections in place. And so that degradation is happening where we don't even see it. And most people aren't even likely to ever see it.
Yeah, I feel like we need to maybe, I'm not saying we're conflating these two things, but there are two separate but related issues here. And there's the environmental sustainability issues, the resource use and those sort of things. And that's one thing. But we're also clearly talking about how human beings are treated and their quality of life. And now you could argue that's another sort of sustainability issue, and I would certainly agree with that. But when you look at it from that standpoint, which we've been doing a lot of, you can make the argument that, well, if you have a group of people, say in some Asian country, that are living on a hand-to-mouth subsistence level, and you put them in a condition in a factory where they are certainly horribly off by rich Western country standards, but now they can afford more things. They can improve, they can get basic health care and things like that. Are we in fact making these folks, is this system making these folks better off? And there's an argument to be made saying, well, yeah, actually, that this rise of all this cheap stuff made in Asia has actually lifted living standards in a meaningful way for hundreds of millions, if not, I don't know, a billion or more people. I'm not actually sure how I feel about that.
Yeah, and the data supports it without question. The neoliberal economic capitalist model that we live under and in, with this global supply chain of exported labor, everything that's going on, that without question, there has been a huge increase in the standard of living. And this is, in fact, why we now have emerging economies, because those are the places that were able to get on board. And in India, it was call centers. In Philippines, it's call centers. In China, it's factory production. In Thailand, factory production in textiles and so forth. Mexico, the whole maquiladora area of textile production. We see this happen in all of these places with emerging economies now. And yeah, there's a rising middle class and they have better buying power. So yes, that is the case. And what those people's parents went through is not anything that we would have, like, those are
except, and from sort of a more radical Marxist or anti-capitalist stance, the argument then would be that, well, the problem is you're defining quality of life and in this system that you are implicitly supporting here. And this idea that your life is better if you have more buying power, that's not a real argument. That's just a way to prop up this system. And how can we say categorically that if you are living with no money in a tight-knit community where you know everyone, where people take care of you, and sure, maybe you have a greater chance of dying from XYZ or not living as long, but is that quality of that life inferior to a life where you're spending 12 hours a day hustling in some factory or taking on 2 jobs and worrying? And that's a reasonable question to raise. And so that's why I'm torn, because I think those arguments against that system, there are some good arguments there. Who are we to say that more buying power makes a better life? Well, of course we're going to say that enmeshed in this only system. We know that capitalism is the water that we swim in. And so we oftentimes can't even envision any sort of alternative. And that to me ties into the sustainability thing, because as you point out, we have this rising middle class who are consuming more. Then that ties right into all of these environmental sustainability and resource sustainability issues. When we talked about food waste and animal agriculture, the planet just, it's really difficult to support, a billion or 2 billion more people who all of a sudden are eating like people might be eating in the United States, right? We don't have an answer for that. And so there's a lot of stuff going on here, and it's really easy to take a position, but I feel like the more I dig into any position that I start to take, the more problems I find with it.
Absolutely. And also, another aspect of commodity fetishism that we don't think about is not just the stuff that's coming out of factories or coming out of, off of farms or whatever, out of the ground, all of these resources that we use that we don't think about, but we have the luxury of using, but the actual human beings who are relocated, right? People who migrate to different places to work, to pick produce or something, but also the commodity fetishism of having a staff. Having people who actually work in your home as nannies or as gardeners or landscapers or something. And those are also people who not only, that's a very different thing than slaving in a factory for 12 hours a day and maybe getting to go home on the train and visit your family, once a month or once every 6 months or something, sending money home. But people who actually are part of this whole global labor supply chain where they actually leave their homes and go and live to an entirely different country and maybe then get to see their family maybe once a year or once every 5 years or something because it's so expensive to travel, that they are part of this commodity, what we have fetishized as having a staff. That elevates our status, doesn't it? having somebody who can drive your kids around. Gives you more time to work and then buy more things and collect more stuff, right?
Yeah, and I think that sort of the dangerous, if you will, type of commodity fetishism isn't the obvious stuff. Like we can all just like, oh my God, there's that guy who needs all the designer this or that. It's the stuff that we don't see. The implicit assumptions that we make about what's necessary to have a decent life that we don't stop to question because they've been so ingrained. And that's what creates, I think, a lot of these, or at least potentially creates a lot of these sustainability problems. Now, but I'll also say, and again, I'm arguing against myself, but I'll also say that there's an argument sort of from the right that would say, well, okay, fine, but there's nothing to say that the system that created these problems is necessarily the system that we're going to have, like, I don't know, 100 years from now or so. I mean, there's an argument, sort of what you call it, the techno-utopian argument, and we'll probably get into that, I imagine at some point more specifically, that essentially from the future, we'll look back on this period of, I don't know, like 1930 to 2030, say, and say, well, yeah, but that was pre Ascension AI model, AGI. That was pre sort of quantum computing and ubiquitous robots and all. That was the era of scarcity where we had to worry about these things. But thank God for that system that created the environment for the sort of innovation and creativity that led to our Star Trekky sort of present now that we have. But boy, it must have sucked to live then, but that was a necessary transitional state to what we have now. And I don't know that I buy that entirely. It's a big gamble to take, but it's not an unreasonable argument, I don't think.
Well, I think that in some ways it kind of is, because one, that assumes that this is the direction these things are going to go. And two, the other side of that, I think, is that why do we have to wait that long? Why does it have to be that way? Yes, corporations are in a race to the bottom and compete with each other all the time. Why are they doing that? Well, because people are consuming this stuff and they are demanding the lowest prices ever. I mean, I saw an article about frustrated, this was around Christmas time, about how frustrated parents were that it's really hard to buy toys for kids, and they're just miserable with like all this because toys, they have so many already, but they have to buy their kids gifts, right, for Christmas. And that what a toy would cost in 1993, based on the consumer price index comparison, in 1993 the toy would have been $20, is now only $4.68. And so we just have a lot more stuff available for a lot that costs a lot less. But again, it's the price. It's not about the actual cost to the environment. And so when we talk about whether or not it's this choice of, oh, we'll just look back and technology will save us, et cetera, why not now try to change our habits, acknowledge what's going on, and not just we can't just vilify the corporations and say, oh, well, it's up to the corporation. They're the ones that are bad. No, it's us. We're the consumers who are allowing, not even just allowing the corporations to continue this behavior, but encouraging that by shopping at TJ Maxx and getting the lowest and replacing our entire outfit. And we will talk about fast fashion and the effects of what happens when you just donate all of those clothes. And that's a whole separate impact for things that don't even go to landfills. But we end up, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, on the opposite side of that, there's this thing I was thinking about with that argument, and why don't we do something now? And there's a thing called, some people might be familiar with, called the Fermi paradox. And basically, it's the idea that this is going to sound like there's no connection, but I promise there is, that it seems very likely that given how big the universe is, that there's got to be other forms of intelligent life out there. But yet, the paradox is that we haven't seen any kind of signs of that. And one of the potential solutions to this was by a guy named Robin Hanson, who's an economist at George Mason, a lot of good people at George Mason, but what he called the great filter. And basically the idea is that, well, maybe there's something that's preventing intelligent life from expanding out. Could it be that, for instance, they get to a certain point and they destroy their planets, destroy their civilizations? And so that's kind of the opposite side of it. We don't want to necessarily just blithely assume that, well, technology will save us from our resource constraints and from all these things, because, hey, there's a good reason to think that it won't. And that gets to your point of, well, just sort of putting our heads in the sand and just kind of hoping that things kind of work themselves out, or blaming the evil, greedy corporations. It's not like corporate executives are any less greedy now, I don't think, than they were 100 or 200 years ago. And so to me, that gets into the question of, well, what can we do? It certainly is overwhelming to try to do everything. You just freeze yourself in place. I wouldn't wish anyone, an hour and a half trying to figure out dog food, right? But I think there are little things. And, earlier you talked about how people sort of, I guess, and it annoys me too, kind of virtue. So, oh, look at my artisanally handcrafted, curated thing that I got from this special, facility handmade with love and kindness by the indigenous peoples of XYZ. Yeah, that stuff makes me want to throw up too. But there's something to it. If a little bit of just kind of that barf-inducing virtue signaling is the price I pay for someone maybe being willing to support something that's made in a slightly better way and being willing to pay for that, I guess I'm okay with that trade-off. And I sometimes make it too. I mean, sometimes and in the knife community, there's a thing called the knife community. Yes, there is. I'm part of it. People say, well, is this knife made in the United States? Now, some of that's xenophobic nationalism stuff, but some of it's also that, well, there are labor laws in the United States that don't apply to knives made in factories in Taiwan or something like that. And so there are little things like that I think, hey, if you're buying it for xenophobia, but it turns out to actually help workers and be more sustainable, I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I think that one of the important options and alternatives, and we'll talk more about this again, is fair trade and ethically sourced goods. It's a way to be able to not pay a whole lot more for a thing, and yet buy it and know that the person who actually produced that is getting fair compensation for what they produced. And that, or in the same vein, that in growing that thing, the coffee or the cocoa beans or the tea leaves or whatever it is, that the environment wasn't being destroyed in the process, and that the people who are working on those plantations aren't being so exploited that that it's child slave labor or it's slave labor for them, or they're not being adequately compensated. And so that's something that there's an alternative to something where you go into a store, and I mean, there are plenty of stores that sell these things, and the reason why they sell them is if you go pretty much any grocery store, if you look, they will have these items because there is that niche community who actually wants those things and people who are willing to pay a bit more for that knowledge. And sometimes the quality is actually better as well. And that's part of the reason why. But sometimes it's virtue signaling because people say, oh, look what I bought at this fair trade arts and crafts, whatever, 10,000 villages rug sale. And I'm helping all these poor women in India because I bought this $400 rug. Hey, I'm with Michael on this. If that means that more people are going to have a better life because somebody wants to show off their fair trade rug, then great.
Yeah, oftentimes, at least what frustrates me is there's oftentimes this big, what I'll call gap in the middle. Like, for instance, I was looking for T-shirts, right? And you would think buying T-shirts is a simple thing. And for most normal people, it probably is. So I go on, like most normal people, I go on Amazon, I need to replace some T-shirts, got the whole bacon neck thing going on, right? They're 10 years old. It's time. But then it's like, well, it's a 3-pack of T-shirts for like $12, $13. And something in me just says, those can't be made in a sustainable way. So say, okay, I'm going to look for an alternative. And then I go to like someplace like American Giant, right? And they'll sell me a T-shirt that's made really well and sustainably and all that for $50. And it's like, well, I'm not going to pay $50 for a T-shirt either. And that's the problem is I think there's a lack of this kind of middle market where it's like it's a $15 single T-shirt that's made reasonably sustainably. And I think I'd like to think that's an underexploited market, if you will, but I don't know. The marketers probably know more than I do, but it's a frustration to someone like me, I think. And I wish there were more of that.
And what we've talked so much about economic appeal, that just doesn't have it doesn't make economic sense to pay basically $150 for the equivalent of what you could get for $12.99. It's like no one in their right mind would want to do that. And certainly on the other side, another consideration of that is it really necessary for a t-shirt to cost $50 to be ethically produced and sourced and environmentally sustainable? And the answer to that is also no, right? So there's this whole exploitation, and this is part of the commodity fetishism as well, and how it ties into some of the things we've talked about with people's choices. Is there is that niche market of people who want to be conscientious and want this stuff, but at the same time, it's just not affordable, like not even legitimately affordable. And that doesn't have to be the way either. And so that whole exploitation is still happening. People who are conscientious are being exploited because they're conscientious, and yet, so where do we try to address this to make change? And this is what's so frustrating about the whole process is we've gotten ourselves into this sustainability hole because of commodity fetishism. We have all these hidden external costs, and capitalism is the market deciding what matters. And if enough people don't care about what matters and push for change, then nothing's going to change. And then you have some people who do care, but then they're exploited in the process of this.
Yeah. I mean, we could do a whole episode. Michael buys a T-shirt, and oh my God, that would be, I don't know, it would be awful or fascinating. It would be infuriating, probably to me. But again, going back to, I think there are little simple things, because I know we hammer on low-hanging fruit, because I think it's important to not all of a sudden just feel overwhelmed by all this, as it's easy to do, to sort of step back and take a breath and say, well, okay, if it takes me a minute and maybe costs a few dollars more to buy something that's fair trade, or just to try to look in one more place and find something, or something that Kimberly does all the time, that when we're out, that I think is worthwhile, when we like go someplace that has chocolate. And she'll ask the person, is this fair trade chocolate? And usually they don't know, and usually the answer is no. But the point is, it's something simple she can do that kind of plants that in the mind of the owners, that someone cares about that. Is that changing the world? No. But again, it's something simple you can do that if enough people do that simple little thing, is likely to make an impact in the longer run.
I recently read an article about low-hanging fruit and using that terminology, and that the author argued that just means you can, I've picked this low-hanging fruit, I'll just go pick more low-hanging fruit. And this author argued that the concept was toxic for sustainability, the sustainability movement. And I read that and I got an entirely different impression. I think that when we start with the low-hanging fruit, what we can do then is we are, like you just mentioned, sort of integrating that into our lives and being just more aware of what's going on. And then we can either move on to more low-hanging fruit and those things that, like, okay, here's another easy thing. I can replace my light bulbs or whatever. Or I think actually what may be more likely to happen, and I say this, anecdotally, because I know this has happened in our lives and other people who I know, is that I think we start to reach higher up on that tree and reach for higher fruit that makes it a little more difficult to change. Like, yeah, at first I was a vegetarian and it was more difficult to move to a vegan diet, but I eventually did it, and it took a while. And still, what if it took a while? But I still got there. And I think that absolutely low-hanging fruit is something still to aspire to, using this terminology and trying to get people to think about what are those simple, easy things to do. And as far as it goes with the chocolate and asking people, there have been plenty of times where people who didn't even know what I was talking about asked me to explain what I was talking about. So if nothing else, that informed them. Maybe their business is never going to have it, but that made them wonder what I was talking about. And maybe that person then is going to think about that the next time that they go and buy chocolate or coffee or whatever it is. I think another aspect of this, in terms of thinking about our options and alternatives and easy things, it goes along with the commodity fetishism. I'm going to hammer this in one more time, right? That what Marx was saying is about our social relations and social relationships with other people. And it was really, I just had jury duty again, actually. They've got my number, man. They're tapping into me. And I noticed a big difference between when I did jury duty this time and when I did it in 2019. And the difference was on the first day in a room full of 150 people, it was dead silent this time. And I looked around the room and I noticed that most people had out devices. Whereas 5 years ago, even just that short amount of time, I recall far more people talking to the people around them. Now, part of this may have been COVID, but at the same time, there were a few people who were wearing masks, and most other people weren't really concerned about that. They were actually sitting in chairs next to each other instead of, spaced apart. So that could have been something that was, in the back of their minds, but I don't know to what extent. What struck me though was the fact that they all had out devices, right? They were all in their own little world. And I think this is really worth talking about, the impact that smartphones have had on us, and how often that you've seen a group of people who are together and they're all on their phones, and some of them are texting each other and instead of actually talking to each other face to face right there. And I think if you're interested, there is a really great photo series by Eric Pickersgill that he did, and it was before COVID even. So this wasn't just a COVID effect, commenting on the lack of interaction between people. And I really encourage you to check it out, and I'll be sure to add it in the show notes, because his whole point is very much what Marx is talking about, that these devices like smartphones and these other commodities have just literally driven us away from other people and social interactions with each other. So, this might not seem, again, like something to do with consumerism and sustainability, but, try having a conversation with somebody next time you're out, rather than, the person in the grocery store line or the person who's in the coffee shop line or something, instead of just, looking down at your device and burying us farther and farther into that hole of commodity fetishism.
Yeah.
And so I think there's one more point worth talking to. If you're still with us and hanging on, we're going certainly past our 30-minute mark at this point. But I think one more thing that's really important about commodity fetishism is to be careful that we're not just co-opted into adding to the problem when we become more conscious consumers. And this is really important because it's not about consuming differently. It's about consuming less stuff overall. So just replacing your whole wardrobe with all fair trade clothes, that would be great, right? Or running out and buying an electric vehicle straight away, that would be great. But do you really need to do that at this point? There's something absolutely to be said for ditching the iridescent light bulbs. Absolutely. But it's much also about only buying what we really need to buy. And I think this is something that sometimes can be lost when we get this political message about our economic habits. So we don't want to fall into the trap of political consumerism, where we're trying to basically raise awareness by buying stuff, because then that means that we're just buying more stuff and using more resources. So I just wanted to make sure that we threw this in.
Yeah.
In considering our...
And I hear what you're saying. People probably get the sense that I don't have any opinions. I'm torn on this as well, right? Because I hear what you're saying, and yet I can't find myself 100% agreeing with that, because there is that pull to me of that argument that this is a system that can potentially be valuable and useful to a lot of people, and by buying less, by slowing down the entire system, I don't know that I'm certainly not as on board with that as I am about being part of the system in a more conscious way. But maybe that's certainly another discussion for another time. But I'll at least be a partially somewhat dissenting voice on that, I guess, as we close.
Well, and we will talk about degrowth and stability and sustainability, because there is all sorts of research that's been done that shows that we in global north countries don't just not only can't, but need to actually consume less stuff to give the rest of the world an opportunity to catch up and have a better standard of living. And so, yes, that's a future episode along with the 17 others that we mentioned. And that's one thing that I really appreciate the comments that people have given us thus far, who want to know more. And there's only so much I can type as quickly as possible to answer people's questions. But there is so much to talk about with sustainability, and we will eventually, hang in there with us. We will cover all of these things that we keep saying, oh, we reference this, oh, a future episode on this. We will get there, but it takes time. And it's like, I like to think of it in terms of when I was teaching, and, you get to the first day of class and go over sort of what international relations or international political economy or sustainability is about. And everybody has 5 million questions on the first day. And I want to answer every single one of them. And then all I can say is, well, we only have this much time today, but we'll get to this. I promise we'll get to this. And that's kind of how I feel with this. So yes, I promise that we will get to these things.
So, Kimberly, yeah, I was going to say, if people do have questions for us or do want to get in touch, what can they do?
Yes. If you enjoyed this episode of Sustainable Planet, or if you hated it, or if you're like Michael and you're on the fence about some things, please let us know. You can do this by email at mail@splanetpod.com. You can do it on Facebook, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn. You'll find these links in our show notes on our website, splanetpod.com, along with additional resources from today's episode, including the Eric Peckersgill link that I'll put on there.
Hey, one other thing, Kimberly, I wanted to mention before folks go, if you're still with us, it really helps out if you can rate and review the show on whatever podcast app you listen to. It's a big factor, especially for newer shows like ours. So if you could just take a minute to do that in your podcast app, it really helps us out.
We really would appreciate that. Because we'd like to reach as many people who care about and are as passionate about these things, or would like to be, or aren't yet, and we can appeal to them, I don't know, as possible. And so thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate it. And you have a great day.